But first, I'd just like to welcome everybody here. Thank you so much for joining us. We are delighted to have you. I'm here hosting with my colleague Araceli Alonso, and we co-direct the Streets project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Streets stands for Social Transformations to End Exploitation and Trafficking for Sex. And Streets is we're a project under the auspices of a larger initiative on UW's campus called 4W, which stands for Women and Wellbeing in Wisconsin and the World. And we're also part of a wonderful platform at UW-Madison, which is the UNESCO Chair on Gender Wellbeing and a Culture of Peace. So those are our three sponsors today. Streets, for those of you who don't know us, and we do have a lot of new people joining us today, and I'm just thrilled to welcome you with us, many from other parts of the country. We are a local to global project seeking to confront human trafficking through education, action research, and community engagement, but all of that being grounded in the perspectives and preferences of survivors. So that's our mission. We do lots of different things. You can learn more about us on our website when it's launched, which will be next month. But today we're just happy to be here as a continuation of our Two-Way Streets online conversations. And growing out of the first one we had in late last year in December, we had requests for more understanding of how we can best serve the needs of our Native American survivor friends and those that we provide services to, and how we can otherwise support them in better, more culturally appropriate ways. So I knew exactly who to go to get help with this question, and our friend Chris Stark is here with us. She's an incredible survivor advocate and artist and has an upcoming novel coming out, which I commend to you all. And Sheila Lamb has also agreed to join with Chris. Both are strong Native women leaders, and thank you, Sheila, for being with us. Sheila's a youth advocate. Both of these amazing women are part of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force in Minnesota. So they have lots of wisdom and insights to share with us, and I'm going to turn it over to both of them to speak they'll probably speak about 45 minutes or so, and then we will have time for questions and discussion after they're done. Okay, so over to you, Chris and Sheila. Thank you.
Go, Sheila. All right. Bonjour. Indigenous Nagamo Zibi Unse Kwe. My Indian name is Singing Little River Woman. And I'm really happy to be here. I'm Anishinaabe and Cherokee and European. And I will turn it over to Sheila for her to introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Bonjour, hello everyone. Sheila Indigenous Jaganashimong, Anangu Kwayendago, Jiboymong, Mainganindu Dame. Like Chris, we share exactly the same heritage, which is incredible. And we're also Wolf Clan. Thank you for having us today.
Yeah. So I'm in Minneapolis currently, and Sheila is up in the Cloquet area. And in the past, just over a week, we've had 7 separate situations with Native women who are being trafficked contact us. And then we also had 3 pipeline workers, the Enbridge pipeline in northern Minnesota, which is going through the Fond du Lac Reservation currently. 3 of them were caught in an underage sex trafficking sting in Itasca County in Minnesota. And so, you know, some of those cases are some of the women that contacted Sheila and I are in different parts of the upper Midwest. And I think it's just really crucial. And I'm really happy to be speaking here with all of you, because obviously, you know, we know that a state line, especially for Native people, is pretty meaningless. So it's really important that we collaborate with each other, and I hope that we can continue to work together. So I'm an author and a researcher. I'm not with any organization. We'll just get started with a little bit of conversation about the history, because it's really important for Native people in particular, and for the understanding of what we're going to be talking about with the contemporary trafficking and prostitution of Native people, Native women and youth, that we situate that in a historical context, because it's a result of hundreds of years of colonization, and prostitution and sex trafficking in general don't happen in a vacuum. It's not something that is occurring on Mars. It's occurring in everyone's neighborhoods. And a lot of times, because of the way that the issue has so much stigma around it, there's a lot of sort of approach to the issue as if this is something that is happening far away. And, you know, I couldn't imagine who these horrendous people are that, you know, are doing this or participating in it. But anyway, so I have done some historical research, and I'm continuing to work on that for my next book. My second novel is going to be due out in April. It's called Carnival Lights. And my first novel, Nichols, A Tale of Dissociation, came out maybe 10 years ago or so. And it's actually set largely in Madison, Wisconsin. I spent a lot of time in Madison, Wisconsin, about 10 or 11 years, working with Project Respect and Jan Miyazaki, who I just love them. But anyway, so in terms of thinking about the what we call sex trafficking and prostitution, because in the Native community that I'm a part of, which is you know, the Minnesota area, but it also extends elsewhere in the country, we include prostitution and sex trafficking together. So that'll probably potentially rile a lot of people, or some people on this call. That's a longer conversation maybe that we can get into another time. But the Canadian First Nation organizations also do the same thing. It's because we see them as a continuum of exploitation. So that is how I will often be talking about it, prostitution and sex trafficking. And that began for Indigenous people on this land when Christopher Columbus landed in what we now call the Caribbean. And he was, his journeys were sanctioned by a papal bull. And that basically said that whatever land is non-Christian, Christians can dominate that, and non-Christian people have no right to that land. So we're looking at something that is rooted in European concepts and European, what is now called European international law, the Doctrine of Discovery. So those ideas that we're currently dealing with in our culture and in our legal system stem from that papal bull from the late 1400s. And Columbus was looking for gold. He was looking for land. He was obviously looking for India as well. And he encountered the people, and one of the first things that he did was to send 550 Indigenous people back to the Mediterranean slave market. And so he also, in his third trip, in his journals, talked about how his men were going around the country looking for 9 and 10-year-old girls because they could be sold as easily and as much as you could sell and buy a farm. And you can find in his journals and his other men's journals just like brutal sexual exploitation of the girls and the women on that land, and basically a massacre. So then as we move very rapidly through the years, and we look at the colonial era, when the other European countries came over, they also instituted or institutionalized prostitution or sex trafficking immediately. So this was brought over by European countries, and it was part of the fabric of this culture of this land or this country from the very beginning. So again, kind of breaking down those ideas that this is something that happened or started happening, 10 years ago, or it started happening when the internet. this has been embedded. And so what that means is that we're talking about an institution of abuse, an institution oftentimes of outright sexual slavery, if we want to use that term, abduction, kidnapping, and so on. And so when we have something like that in our country and in our society, that means that there's going to be people who are used in it, right? So it really, there's going to be people used in it. And in terms of Indigenous people, because we were here from the very beginning, we were a main target of that from the very beginning. And a lot of times people don't understand how deep those patterns go culturally and get passed down through generations of the perpetrators and also through the generations of those who have been harmed and violated in those ways. So George Washington told his men to go out and completely lay waste to a native settlement, wipe it out. He kept some of the younger women for sexual use, for rape by his men, and then they killed them in a more shameful manner. And I could go through example after example after example historically about our leaders who are revered in this country, participating in genocide of Native people, which also included sexual exploitation, rape, murder, slavery. 2.5 to 5 million Indigenous people were enslaved by various European countries. And that's something that is not well known at all either. And they were used in plantations for labor, what we would call labor trafficking now, sexual exploitation, and working construction. And they were often shipped back overseas to Europe or shipped down to the Caribbean colonies, the outposts for the European countries. So we see these patterns repeat over and over and over again, you know, and the sexual exploitation of Indigenous people being tied with the land, because the purpose of the settlers coming over here was to take the land and therefore to clear the Indigenous people who are here off of the land. And we see again and again and again that the sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, abduction, murder, genital mutilation, military members cutting out the genitals of the Indigenous women that they had just slaughtered and putting them on their hats and their saddle horns. Brutal, brutal, brutal exploitation going on for hundreds of years, targeting Indigenous women and also, you know, girls and sometimes boys and men as well. So what we have now up in this area, and I'll go more quickly over this, is, you know, in Minnesota, we can't necessarily perfectly measure these things, obviously, but we have a tremendous amount of the trafficking of Native women in Minnesota. And the way that I think about that is I think about that port at the Duluth Superior Port and the amount of trafficking that has gone on at that port since at least the early 1900s. And so again, we have this established site where you have sailors coming in and you have all of this industry happening, right? You have the lumber, you have the grain industries, even from the plains being shipped over to be shipped out through the port. You have the mining. The Iron Range in northern Minnesota has supplied this country with 75% of its steel. So you have a significant amount of industry that's happening, being shipped in and out. You have all of these men there. You look at the Iron Range back in the 1800s, to quote them, prostitutes walked about during the day. So again, you know, these ideas that this is something that just happens in a city or whatever is just like completely ahistorical, totally false. And just off of the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota in the early 1900s, there was a squaw house of ill fame, and a white Bemidji man owned that. And it was just on the other line of the Red Lake Reservation. And so we see throughout the centuries to up to our times right now, we see the targeting of Indigenous women along these tropes of them being wild, being savage, being exotic, being even equated with the devil. That was also a really common theme, 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And we see that just continue right up to our times now, which we'll talk about briefly later.
We see sex trafficking connected to several things. Most people are well aware of sex trafficking being associated with things like the Super Bowl, hunting, ice fishing. But one of our biggest obstacles is when we talk about sex trafficking in extractive industries. And that's because the amount of money that comes from these industries, the pay and the jobs provided, very quickly brushed off when I was discussing they're attacking the industry, we're eco-terrorists, and a multitude of other things. But the truth of the matter is, our task force here in Minnesota, Canadian Inquiry, and other studies done in various places in the world have all been able to make direct connections between extractive industries and sex trafficking. And there's the pattern which BCA and Trust have been really good at trying to get information out there on. That's when you bring in a multitude of men away from their homes, high-paying jobs, you're going to find trafficking, drug and alcohol use, and these men are going to try to find ways to entertain themselves. And sadly, like we just saw with Itasca County, that does not exclude using minors for sex. We also see patterns of behavior with these men, and I'll use these 7 that were recently arrested as an example, where they have histories, some of them with domestic violence. And that's something you also see in boom towns and along extractive industry routes, because they will pose as boyfriends until they get tired of a young woman. They will, come across to their communities as these fine, upstanding men. If you go on the Facebook pages of some of these 7, they come across as devout Christians. You would not know, looking at them, what's going on and that they're true perpetrators. And I put on my Facebook page the last couple days, monsters are everywhere. And you would think that people with good paying jobs and families would not be directly linked to sex trafficking or purchasing young men and women for sex, but they are. And that's one of the difficulties, is trying to profile potential buyers or buyers can be extremely difficult because of the way that they come across. In Rosebud, when KXL1 was going through, the chief of police at the time was a female who went into a man camp on a separate call and found a 4-year-old little girl running naked through this camp that had been raped and assaulted a multitude of times. And every time we make this link and we tell this story in regards to extractive industries, we're always silenced in one form or another, which makes the work more difficult. And we're silenced because these corporations like to give themselves a pass. What's happening here in Minnesota, the pass is, we don't have a man camp. We did a training for each of these individuals, telling them sex trafficking was wrong, and we did our part. But they're not even doing significant background checks. We've been told by former pipeliners and those currently in the industry that the main background checks are for nothing more than simply theft. They aren't looking at priors for trying to purchase sex or for actually succeeding in doing so. They're not looking for priors for things like domestic violence. And those attitudes towards women, towards Indigenous people especially, is part of the problem. Indigenous people are also higher commodities because we can be passed off as different races to fulfill that fantasy. So we need to really hit the buyers hard. And current laws are so insufficient. Even though one bill is changing to turn buying sex into a gross misdemeanor, what's been on the books is someone can get away with as little as 20 hours of community service for violating another human being, for enslaving them in the sex trade. We see plea bargains constantly where they're not held accountable for their actions, especially those who are trafficking. And we see the direct correlation, sadly, to our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in association with sex trafficking, including those that are being trafficked by those in extractive industries. When you're trying to take on major corporations and infrastructure within a country like the United States, you know, you're taking on the big boys, and you're seeing that when it comes to white males of high income, their voice seems to matter much more than those that have been victimized, survived this, and know firsthand from experience what's being done.
You're on mute, Chris, sorry.
I posted a couple of links in the chat there for people to check out if they're interested. There's the Garden of Truth, the prostitution and sex trafficking of Native women. And there were, I think, 5 of us, 4 Native women, and we worked with Melissa Farley. And the organization here in Minnesota is MUSAC, Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And we collaborated with Prostitution Research Education to do this research, quote unquote, so that we could bring forward the experiences of Native women who are in prostitution and trafficking. That's online, and we wanted, to make that as accessible as possible so that people can, be educated and learn about it. And then also, if there's any, Native communities that wanted to do something similar in their community as well, they would kind of have that as a model to take a look at. So we entered this project out of the stories of the trafficking of Native women and youth on the ships in Duluth. And I'm no longer a member of the coalition because of my work schedule, but we entered that with the coalition not really knowing very much about it. I am a survivor of child and trafficking by family members. And so I had been, I have been doing this work for a long time. And so that's kind of how we came together to do this. But we did it out of the trafficking on the ships, those stories, as they're very common for Native women, especially in Minnesota and Wisconsin, to kind of talk about that quietly amongst ourselves about, have you seen so-and-so? No, I haven't seen her. The last time that she was seen, she went out on the ships. That is a common story, more so maybe 20 or 30 years ago. But for our community to lose, as Sheila was referencing, MMIW, for us to lose women and youth on those ships, they go out on those ships and they never return, and nobody knows what happened to them. So as I see it, as I sort of mentioned, as I see that as really the root of the very high rates, disproportionate rates of MMIW in this area, and also the sex trafficking Native people. So what we did is we interviewed 105 Native women who are in prostitution and trafficking in Minnesota. And we had a culturally specific form that we created ourselves, the Native women. And then we used other forms that PRE had used elsewhere in the country. And we went around to Minneapolis, we went to Duluth, and then we went to Bemidji to interview the women. And some of the stories that stick out in my mind was the women in Minneapolis who would talk about quite frequently about how happy they would get when it snowed, because that meant that they didn't have to give a blowjob to some man on the street to get $5 to go to McDonald's and eat. Food is a factor. Food is a starvation by the government, purposeful starvation by the government of Indigenous people is a historical issue. And food and availability to food and healthy food continues to be an issue, both for Indigenous people, some Indigenous people living on reservations, and then also some Indigenous people in the Twin Cities or urban areas who are living in poverty. Not everyone is living in poverty, obviously. So we see that issue of starvation, and we see the history books also sometimes talking about how the government would withhold food that was promised to the Native people through treaties. They would withhold the food, and then they would force the women to engage in prostitution before releasing the food to the Native community. So that's something that really sticks out in my mind. You know, up in Duluth, we did almost half the studies in Duluth, half of the interviews in Duluth, and we could have done many, many more, but there were 4 of us up there to do the interviews, and we completely ran out of resources, and we ran out of, frankly, the ability to continue to do that with the 4 of us, because the interviews were so disturbing. So some of the information that we gathered from that, again, you can go and read it yourself, but almost half of the women had been sexually abused as children by an average of 4 perpetrators. So you've probably heard that, incest or child abuse, child sexual abuse in particular, as being a very common factor among people who are in prostitution and trafficking. And we saw that very clearly. One of the women up in Duluth was almost 60 years old, and she sat down with me to be interviewed, and she started screaming at me, "I've been raped my whole life. What else do you want to know?" And she yelled that at me over and over again until she calmed down a little bit, and then we proceeded with the interview. And one of the things she talked about right away was being used by family members in pornography starting at the age of 4. And she was, almost 60, and this was close to 15 years ago. So 52% of the women had post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of the interview, which is a rate similar to combat war veterans. 92% identified as having been raped. However, when you understand what the daily experiences of people who are in prostitution and trafficking are, that very high number takes on an even different quality when you consider that, for instance, in Minneapolis, a woman, met a white man driving through a poor neighborhood at 6 in in order to engage in prostitution, and he pulled her fingernails and toenails out with pliers. So the amount of violence that the women and youth are experiencing in this is so high and so beyond people who have not been used in this to understand that when I say 92% had been raped, 100% was likely. So 84% identified as having been physically assaulted in prostitution, 72% suffered traumatic brain injuries, 98% were currently or previously homeless. So again, obviously that takes us directly back to the dispossession of land, the breaking of the 500 treaties that have been signed in the US, every single one of them has been broken by the US government. And we, you know, understand homelessness. We understand domestic violence. We understand child sexual abuse, poverty, food insecurity, all of these factors interplaying in a variety of different ways in the lives of Indigenous women and youth who are in prostitution and trafficking. And 92% of the women that we interviewed said that they wanted to leave prostitution and trafficking immediately, but were unable to do so. You know, and so these numbers are, you know, if you're not that familiar with the issue, I would ask you to go through and take a look at this because the numbers are quite high. I'm just going to jump for a second to the ships and then I'll give it back to Sheila. And so one of the things that I did an independent study a few years later with Native women who had been trafficked out on the ships. And again, one of the things that they talked about was that the sailors would tell them, if you don't do what we say, we will throw you overboard. And then again, we cycle back to how many stories there are in Indian country where, you know, women have disappeared and the last time that anybody saw them was when they were taken out on those ships. I talked with the women, it was a common experience for them to be taken on those ships to other ports and then dropped off in a port with nothing. They were maybe dropped off in New Orleans and kicked off the ship and the ship left. And they're standing there in New Orleans after having been on that ship for however many months being sexually assaulted. One of the, I interviewed, I talked with two men as well. And one of them had multiple family members on both sides. And these were women and they were also girls and they were also boys as well. And they had been taken out onto those ships as an intergenerational situation. And talking with him about his experience as someone who had never been sexually abused on those ships and not taken out onto those ships, talking with him was like talking to a survivor. He was so traumatized by what his family members had been through and the kind of loss that they have suffered. And he used to go out onto the ships and get his cousins off of the ships and find them. And he would relate to me what he saw when he would find his cousins as the ship had been docked. And I think that's something that is really telling in the Native community, but I also think it's something that needs to be discussed more in trafficking of any group of people or any community. Is this impact is not just about these terrible things that happen to an individual. This impacts the family. This impacts the community. This impacts, you know, whoever comes into contact with those people, because people are carrying this trauma and it's suffering and it's loss and it's pain. One of the women that I spoke with who had been used on the ships for years said at the end of the interview, she started crying. She was also close to 60. She started crying and said, you know, please just get us a room and a table and some pamphlets so that we can come together and talk to each other. She said, you know, every day I wake up depressed and lonely and miserable and so forth because of what happened on those ships. And then she was just crying and she said it was hell, it was pure hell. So that's just a real quick synopsis to think about the interconnections of all of these different issues that the Native community has faced, suffered under, but also survived. And you know, we also have a lot of wonderful things happening in the Native community as well. It's not just trauma.
When it comes to youth, they are highly targeted, including the LGBTQ community. Often the excuse is, oh, I'm going to change you. You aren't going to want that anymore. They come up with these really horrific excuses to justify what they're doing and their predatory behaviors. We see that children are being trafficked out of foster homes, out of their biological homes, or it's children that cannot stay home for one reason or another. Maybe it's abuse, maybe it's poverty. It could be that they're being harmed in the home, whether it's trafficking or another type of violence or addiction going on in the home. Then these youth are on the streets, they're cold, they're hungry, they're homeless, looking for help. And that makes them a very easy target, because the trend now is no longer the use of pimps, they're boyfriends. And you give a young person that sense of comfort where they think they're going to be helped, they're going to be taken care of. They become more vulnerable, when the reality is we see that our children and teens are often locked away in closets. They're shot up with drugs to make them addicted and dependent on drugs, and they're perpetrators. We find that they're sometimes chained in basements, and the youth that I've worked with have stories that you would never imagine would come from those under the age of 20 years old, often under the age of 18. They're targeted because they aren't going to be noticed being missing as much. They rely on the system not wanting to search for them when they go missing. They get labeled as chronic runaways within the system, for example. They like to often put a stigma of mental health issues as an excuse of why someone is running away. But yet we find the reality of it is it's quite often the school resource officers that are identifying Native youth that are being trafficked. And we see the same thing through our Indian education program. These are the people that are looking for patterns of behavior. A student goes missing for 1 to 2 weeks at a time with no explanation and suddenly returns. We see changes in their behavior, their attire, their grades start to slip. These are kids that may have been doing phenomenally, and suddenly we see these changes. And they have been a tremendous help in the effort of identifying trafficked youth. But it's not enough. We sadly lack community awareness and understanding of what grooming of both communities and individuals even looks like. We have people that make the assumption, oh, not in my neighborhood, or it's not my problem. And whenever Chris and I or others are doing these panels, I always stress that though Indigenous people and people of color are targeted the most, no one gets a pass from this. No one is exempt from having a child in their family from being trafficked. We see it in all walks of life. We see it in affluent neighborhoods, rural communities, and definitely in our poorer communities. So we have to focus on things like legislation that address teaching sex trafficking to children in healthcare classes in middle and high schools, what grooming looks like, how to protect themselves, and most especially how to get help if they or someone they know is being trafficked. We need to talk about consent, and Senator Mary Kunesh is just phenomenal working on legislation such as this. But the work is tremendous. And the only way that we can break these cycles of the abuses that are occurring in systems such as foster care is to continue to push the envelope and work on these issues. Work on really digging into foster home care, how the foster care system, both ICWA and CPS, deal with runaway situations. We addressed so many of these issues, including data practices on the task force. And yet time and time again, we were finding gaps, that it wasn't a lack of willingness within systems and agencies to address them. It's just that there were so many and there's such an influx of Indigenous children that have been removed from the home and put into the foster care system. And it's so easy for those kids to get lost. They just totally get lost. They've run away 10 times. Oh, we're kind of writing them off. They'll be back. It's those attitudes that seem to be fairly prevalent. And we've seen the same thing through the Canadian inquiry, that when you take Native children out of their community, away from their culture, and you break the connection that they have, you're going to make them more vulnerable. So part of addressing these issues is Indigenous-centered care and trauma response. If we are to truly heal, whether it's our youth or our adults, we need to be able to guide our own healing processes in the way that they're done instead of having them dictated to us. Westernized medicine often is not the answer for Indigenous people that have been trafficked and suffered things like severe domestic violence. We need our sweat lodges, our ceremonies. We need our sisters. We heal tremendously through art and reconnecting with the earth. And that's one of the biggest pitfalls with allies with the best laid intentions, is making assumptions, whether it's our youth or adults, that we will heal and process trauma the same way that others do. If we can sit and address these issues from homelessness on with our youth, we can start to break these cycles. We can create generational healing instead of generational trauma. And we can continue to move forward and end up with strong individuals out there addressing these issues like Chris Stark and Jessica Smith and a multitude of others. And we definitely need strong voices out there for the youth. Youth advocacy work with trafficked youth is nothing shy of a nightmare. It's traumatic in itself to look in the faces of children and youth 24 and under and see that a haunted, pained look, that even when they're smiling, it's there. And to know when you hear their stories, what they've been through before they've even really had a chance to start life. So think of the youth as you're working with individuals. Think about giving them a chance to have a childhood and a real future, because this is where we start to turn things around. And by backing legislation to create that awareness for both communities and our youth, that is one of the ways we have fallen short of combating the issue of sex trafficking among our 24 and under.
Yeah. And I'll just say also that in a lot of times when people talk about sex trafficking or prostitution, they talk about women aging out and being sort of discarded by the ring or the pimp or whatever. And one of the things that we see in the Native community is that we have grandmothers and we have great grandmothers who have been in prostitution and trafficking for much, if not all of their lives, because of the incredible number of barriers that exist that Indigenous people have to continually surpass. And so they are unable to get out of the prostitution. They're unable to get out of the sex trafficking. We have women in the Twin Cities area who are great grandmothers who are still trapped in this system and being brutally raped, picked up off the streets and being brutally raped. And so, you know, on their behalf, on the youth behalf, we believe that our behaviors now can heal our ancestors, and that our behaviors now and the things that we do now in our lives also will pave the way for future generations to not have to go through, like Sheila so eloquently talked about, that healing that intergenerational harm. And it's through ceremonies in particular you know, that many of us find our way back and find our healing. I know that before I moved back to Minnesota and got started in ceremonies and, you know, became part of the community again, you know, here in Minnesota, that it was just like trying to keep my head above water day after day after day, trying to keep my head above water, trying to survive what had happened to me and not really being helped, you know, by what the white institutions offered. And it was when I came back, I got my Indian name and I, you know, started ceremonies. That's when everything changed for me. So, you know, Native people need to determine what they need based on themselves as individuals, obviously. But having those culturally appropriate services and reconnecting with traditional ways is just tremendously powerful. And that's how, you know, we will break these chains that started in 1492. So, miigwech.
Thank you both. We're gonna have the small group discussion shortly, but for maybe just a couple more minutes, Sheila and Chris, could you throw out some of those really kind of specific tension points, for example, in residential, in shelters for victims and the tobacco issue and some of those things you shared with me earlier. You've laid out many of the things we need to keep in mind, but when you're providing services to Native youth and others, what are some of the points where we fall short, we make mistakes?
Well, I think the lack of cultural understanding is a portion of that. And this isn't just in organizations that are trying to deal with these issues directly head on. We see it in the judicial system, we see it in the schools, we see it within police departments. So it's that cultural competency piece that I think it is so important. Understanding that that soft handshake is a sign of respect, not disrespect and avoidance. Understanding not making eye contact is again a sign of respect, or not having trust within the system or the police. That's another one. We need to do so much building bridge work in order to have that trust again. We see so many jurisdictional issues as it is, where tribes, because of sovereignty and us being a public law 280 state, for example, the tribes cannot go ahead and prosecute non-Indigenous offenders for things like this on tribal lands. So we run into those types of issues and that disrespect for that sovereignty and the ability to prosecute whatever happens on Native land. We see a disconnect quite often, and those assumptions and labels. We're drunks, we're all using drugs, those types of things. So being able to check your own prejudices that you may not even realize you have, but it's what you've heard most of your life and it has been passed through families. And those aspects of racism is another way those things can be addressed to start to change the approach. And one of the biggest ones that stands out to me always is that assumption that non-Indigenous people have better answers for us and know better what is right for us than we do. We need that trust and respect that we understand how to heal our own people and ourselves. And we're not looking for the great saviors to come to us. We're looking for that opportunity to stop being victimized and brutalized and to heal and for generations to come to break these cycles.
That was beautiful, Sheila. Thank you. And also, you know, little things like in shelters. First of all, you can't assume because of the impact of the attempted genocide, you know, a lot of Native people are not connected to traditional ways. Sorry, my cat. You know, so there's varying degrees of connection and awareness of Native cultures among Native people because of those disconnections that we've been talking about. But for instance, like if it's a shelter, we hear stories about, you know, women being accused of being on, you know, smoking marijuana when they're saging. So using the basic traditional medicines like sage or cedar or sweetgrass. We've heard stories like in a shelter where the flu started to go around or the cold started to go around or something like that. And everybody got sick except for the Native woman and her kids because she knew to go out and get cedar and make it into a tea. And none of them got sick. And then the staff and literally, you know, some of the other residents are like calling her, you know, a witch and all of this kind of stuff. And so maybe for some people on here, that sounds like, what? Like that sounds really out there. Maybe you don't have those kinds of ideas, but they do exist and Native people experience them frequently. Even something as simple as putting tobacco down at the base of a tree, you know, to start the morning prayer and to end the evening with a prayer. People comment on it. My neighbors say things to me like, what are you doing over there? Like, you know, and they, you know, so that kind of stuff, those what we call microaggressions, right? That happens a lot. And there's so much deep suspicion of Native people and Native ways. It's ingrained in this country. And like Sheila said, rather than, you know, be like, oh, you know, oh, I feel guilty about that, or I'm not that way, how dare you say that, or whatever, you know, really take some time to learn about these things from Native people, from Native books, and, you know, be more aware of how deeply embedded this is in our country, even though we're largely invisible and CNN referred to us as something else during the, you know, the presidential elections recently. Those attitudes are deeply ingrained. There are still over 1,000 sites in this country that have the name Squaw on it. Squaw Tit Peak, Squaw Valley. And squaw is a term that was used for vagina, which was also basically calling Native women whores, essentially. And so those kinds of attitudes are deeply embedded. One of the women we interviewed with Garden of Truth said that one of the white men who had bought her for sex said to her, I thought we killed all of you. So, you know, becoming more aware of that. It might not be in your face, you particularly, but it's here, and Native people experience those things a lot. So finding ways that your services are inclusive, you know, making Native people not invisible, and really paying attention to just those really basic things like, you know, I wanna smudge in my room and not have everybody start accusing me of using marijuana.
Great,
I
thank
think
you.
another important part of this that needs to be addressed real quick too is understanding the need to not touch or handle sacred items. It may be a feather, it may be a bundle, it may be a multitude of things. Not touching a medicine pouch. Those things are held sacred to us. And I know one time crossing the border to go see some family, I had Border Patrol open my medicine pouch, and it's a deeply violating feeling. So always understanding the importance of those items and why it's important not to touch them is another component of this too, especially in shelters and foster homes and so forth.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you. Ara, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think we do have a small group exercise to get you all to come discuss some of these issues, but there may be a few questions we want to take first. Ara?